Hi there. Thanks for joining us for the sermon video for August the 30th, 2020 at Trinity Mennonite Church. My name is Will, and my question today is, do you remember the old name of something? And you sometimes have to scramble and think what the new name is? Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 20. Now, when Jesus came to the area of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the human one is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah, or one of the other prophets." He said, "And what about you? Who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Then Jesus replied, "Happy are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because no human has shown this to you. Rather, my Father who is in heaven has shown you. I tell you that you are Peter, and I will build my church on this rock. The gates of the underworld won't be able to stand against it. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Anything you fasten on earth will be fastened in heaven. Anything you loosen on earth will be loosened in heaven." Then he ordered the disciples not to tell anybody that he was the Christ. One of the stories that I've been following with interest over the summer is the names that have been changing of things. Some products have changed their packaging, sports teams have changed their names, statues have been toppled. And this is a natural outcome of people changing their minds about things, becoming more aware about things, and just becoming convicted of things that they weren't in the past. And we have these situations where all of a sudden we forget what the new name was, and we don't want to look like we're out of touch. And sometimes we just like the old name. And we like the old wording, and so we're going to hold on to that because that meant something and the new one doesn't. We have this with geography too. Where I grew up in the country, we didn't have the proper street names and numbers for a long time. So if for some reason you would order a pizza, you had to give a paragraph description of where you lived. And then sometimes there was a different name. Different groups of people had different names for the same road. Well, what finally happened is the government said we need names. These need to be standardized so that when there's a fire, the trucks will find it in time. But sometimes the government added a new name that wasn't what people used. People actually used a different one. For example, there's a road that runs along the lake. Technically it's the first concession. But for a long time, we called it Lakeshore Road because it was along the shore of the lake. Makes sense. Well, when they changed it, they called it Nova Scotia Line. And then there were these conversations with old people and young people, and the young people used the name that was on the sign because why not? And the old people used the name that they had used their whole lives. Names change. The way that we identify things changes, sometimes in ways that we don't like. In the story that we're reading today, Jesus and his disciples are in the area of Caesarea Philippi. And this is an interesting name, and it begs an important question. Why is there a city named Caesarea, clearly named after the Caesar? Why is there a city named Caesarea Philippi within Jewish territory? It doesn't make sense. So what had happened was it was a city of a different religious and cultural group. And then King Herod got a whole bunch of extra land, was given the power to control a new section of land. And he changed that city into one that he was controlling. And even though he was King Herod, a Jewish king, inheriting the legacy of Jewish kings, instead of calling it a Jewish name, he called it Caesarea Philippi. And this happened a lot in those days and still happens now, that people would use a government-sounding name to curry favor with the government. So Herod wanted to give a name that would honor Caesar because he sort of was of the opinion that if he honored Caesar, Caesar would honor him. So there is a city called Caesarea. Now, the Philippi comes from Herod was honoring his one of his sponsors, somebody who was part of his legacy and was giving him money from time to time, named Philip. Philip II, Philip the Tetrarch for the history buffs. And so this was Caesarea within the legacy of Philip, but also because there was another Caesarea closer to the Mediterranean Sea, and so that was Caesarea Maritima, and this was Caesarea Philippi. So this name that doesn't seem to fit is there. Now, the conversation that we have doesn't indicate that there was a conversation before, but it seems like there might have been one. It seems like very naturally it could have been this, that the disciples are coming up to this place. They're talking about the name of Caesarea Philippi. And they might be asking, hey, have you been to the other Caesarea? Have you been to the place closer to the water? It must be beautiful. And as fishermen, maybe they're talking about the fish that's there. But they could also say, oh, I remember, my dad used to talk about it by its old name. And some people might refer to it as the old name as a sign of disrespect to the emperor and intentionally kind of pushing back on government power. And so they would have conversations. Do you like the new name or the old name? Which one do you want to call it? So Jesus could have been leading this conversation. Jesus had a lot to say about Herod. Jesus had a lot to say about allegiances to thrones and powers. And so there could very naturally have been this conversation about all of this just from the name Caesarea Philippi. And then the conversation about names continues. Now, the Bible doesn't say that this happened, but it seems to flow naturally in this direction. So then building off of that, Jesus could have said this. He could have been building this story on top of the old one. But speaking about names, then he says, okay, so we know what the crowds are saying about Caesarea Philippi. We know which names the crowd likes. What names do they use for me? Who do the crowds say that I am? Who do the people say that I am? So the disciples are ready for this. They've been paying attention. And they explain, well, some people say that you are Elijah, some John the Baptist, other prophets. And then Jesus asks the follow-up question, but who do you say that I am? And this is the question for us, right? This is the question when we sit down to read this story, we put ourselves in the position of Peter. Jesus asks us who we are, who he is in our eyes. And this is the guide that we have. We should answer like Peter. Now, I've talked about this story before. We've looked at this before, and there's a lot in it that we could build off of. We could look at the answer that Peter gives, and what does it mean for Jesus to be the Messiah? We could talk about how Jesus is the Son of the living God as opposed to the dead gods of the statues that the neighboring peoples worshipped, as opposed to the Caesars who declared themselves gods but then died. There's a difference there between who God is and who Jesus is, in contrast to those non-living gods. There's a whole lot we could say about that, about the legacy that we inherit from Peter that Jesus begins with. But as I was reading it this time around, something kind of different jumped out to me. Because right now we're looking at the crowds. This is our summer sermon theme, and this is part of this story. Jesus says, who do the crowds say that I am? And as I emphasized that in my reading, I started to de-emphasize the actual words of Peter's answer. And I started wondering if there was something else behind the answers that the other people were giving, the crowds, why is it that they would say that Jesus was Elijah? Why is it that they would say John the Baptist when Jesus and John the Baptist were relatives, had grown up together, coexisted? So those answers, in a lot of ways, don't really make sense. Well, we can only speculate, but it seems that the people would have had sort of a vested interest, that they wanted to be able to identify Jesus in a particular way. Now, all of these things are really complementary, in fact. For them to say that Jesus is Elijah, they're saying, we recognize in this man that he's bringing us a message from God. He's speaking with God's power, and it's continuous with what the prophets have told us before. And if we call him Elijah, then we're making all of these statements about where Jesus comes from. Or they could say, well, we knew John the Baptist. He was really good. He spoke powerfully. He lived a good example. But now here's Jesus. Jesus has more power. He speaks with more authority. He can do special miracles that John couldn't do. So maybe that's where he got the power from, because John just now reincarnated himself into Jesus. And that's why he has the power to heal. And if we get that right, then maybe Jesus will heal me. And so people will come to their opinions about who Jesus is, and they might then argue back and forth about which option it was. So the disciples have brought these answers together, and we also sort of then might want to ask the question, why did Jesus ask this? Why is he surveying them? Now, this happens when we are students at school. Our teachers will ask us questions that the teacher already knows the answer to. So maybe Jesus wants to see, are you guys paying attention? Are you listening to what's out there? Or maybe Jesus is ready to build on the answers that they give. Because there's a whole bunch of times where Jesus hears things or knows things that he wouldn't normally be able to, except that he seems to have divine knowledge in a lot of the stories. So it seems that Jesus would know what people were saying about him. So he doesn't ask because he doesn't know. He asks because he wants the disciples to know, to respond. Now, when we do this, a lot of times we're sort of ready for a response. So if someone was to ask you, hey, what's your understanding of racism? Well, some of us will say, oh, yeah, racism is just when you hate people who have a different background than you, and then you act that out. And other people will say, well, racism is a systemic injustice in our society. Well, if you give one answer, you are identifying with a dominant voice in our world. And if you give a different answer, then you identify with that group. And so when we're asking the question, most of the time we're already preloaded with those two options. Hey, what's your understanding of racism? Are you in party A or party B? We could ask the same thing about a particular news story. A politician or an athlete or just somebody who is involved in a story. As one of many, we could say, hey, that African-American man in the States who was shot by the police, what do you think of him? Well, if you say, well, he was resisting arrest and he did have a criminal record, well, that sounds like a particular party. And then you could say, well, this is a clear example of systemic racism and injustice of a continuing line. And, well, that sounds like the other party. And when you're asking the question, you sometimes are preloaded, ready to assign to two different groups. So as I was reading this story here, Jesus could have been doing the same thing. Jesus could have been saying, okay, then which one am I? What do you think? Am I Elijah? Am I John the Baptist? What's your experience? And so the disciples, they had heard him teaching, obviously, and the disciples had seen the miracles and seen the power, and so they could have participated in the debate that was happening in society around them about who Jesus was, about who people were saying that he was. But Peter didn't do that. Now, Peter gave a good theological answer, and maybe it's just because Jesus said it was good, then we in the church have copied this. So Peter's rooting his answer in something. Maybe he was paying attention, and he's just repeating back to Jesus something that he said a while ago. But I think it might be more than that, because everybody else also paid attention. Why wouldn't Jesus let everybody answer and have all of them say the same thing? But Peter speaks up. He speaks up above the group and gives his own answer. And so he says, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, you are the anointed one of God. Now, Peter, having given his life to follow Jesus, has a reason to hope that this person he's put everything into has been anointed to a special task, because Peter has chosen Jesus for a special task, and he's also hoping that God has. Well, also to say that he's the Son of the living God could be differentiating him from the other gods. He could also be saying that this is what I am doing. I'm doing this for life. I'm giving my whole life to you. And so you're a son of the living God, and I'm participating in a living thing. Whatever it is, it seems to be, I think, rooted in Peter's experience. But it is not rooted in what everybody else is saying. So who is Jesus to you? We could go through our church history books, and we could go through our denominational structures, and we could say, well, I like this answer that this particular church gives. I like the answer that this author gives, or that this historical church institution gives. But I think a big part of what Jesus likes about Peter's answer is that Peter's answer is honest, and it is rooted in Peter's encounters with Jesus. So who is Jesus to you? From your encounters, from your relationship, who is Jesus? You don't have to say that he's the Christ and the Son of the living God. You can believe that. But if your experience is that Jesus has healed you, then you can say Jesus is the great physician. If your experience is that Jesus has redeemed you from a low view of yourself, from a low opinion of who you are based on everybody else, then you're going to have a different name. Then Jesus is Father. Jesus is somebody who has given you your name, a new name, a better name, a more loving name than you got from other people. Who is Jesus to you? The natural temptation is to give a preloaded answer that other people have given. But I think what Jesus wants from us is that we have a new name. We have a description of Jesus rooted in our experiences. So as we let Jesus into our life, as we let him deeper into who we are and into every part of our life, then we will encounter Jesus in our weaknesses, in our hurts, and we will walk with Jesus to victory. We will walk with Jesus to new strength, and we will experience his love in new ways. And in those encounters, we will come up with new names, new descriptions for Jesus of who he is. So don't get sucked into the way that the crowd wants to divide you. Don't get sucked into your expectations of what you think the crowd wants you to say. Who is Jesus to you? Root that in your experiences, in your reading, in your prayers, in your love. Who do you say that Jesus is?